Hey, Morgan.
Hey, everybody.
Hey, me. Hey, everyone. Welcome to the 2026 Virginia Cannabis Conference. I'm J.M. Pedini, the Development Director here at NORML, the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws. I'm joined by Morgan Fox, NORML's Political Director, and we're going to start the panel about federal cannabis policy. We're going to talk about rescheduling. And thanks to everyone who is joining us virtually. We're going to be switching between this audience and our live audience here. So we're going to have Morgan be up mostly. And Morgan, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself to everyone?
Hey, everybody. Morgan Fox. I am NORML's political director based in Washington, D.C. I've been with the organization since the beginning of 2022, but have worked in cannabis policy since 2008, starting with Marijuana Policy Project and then National Cannabis Industry Association. My day-to-day job, for the most part, is just talking to members of Congress, but end up kind of bleeding into a lot of other state-level areas too, because that's where the vast majority of cannabis policy reform is taking place. But very happy to be here. Very sorry I couldn't be there in person. Thanks, Amtrak, and very glad that y'all came out for this.
Well, Morgan, I think we'll go ahead and start with a conversation about the effort at the federal level to reschedule marijuana from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3. Morgan, why don't you talk a little bit for everyone about what the executive order means?
Well, first, I'd like to provide a little bit of historical context. So since cannabis was initially placed in Schedule 1 back in the early 70s, there have been several attempts to remove it from Schedule 1, which is defined as a substance that has a high potential for abuse and no accepted medical value within the United States. Now, we clearly know that that is not an appropriate placement for cannabis, and most medical professionals know it as well, but the government has been very slow to catch up with modern science. And since that time, we have seen several attempts to actually reschedule cannabis. Some of them have dragged on for years. And the most recent attempt to move it was started by President Biden, a little bit unwittingly. He was never really a huge fan of it, but I think that he recognized both the sensibility and political utility of beginning this move. That process dragged on for quite a while and then eventually stalled at the beginning of last year due to allegations of collaboration between opponents of the proposed rule and the DEA. The process has been on hold up until now, and I guess technically it is still on hold, but the middle of last month, President Trump made an executive order directing the Department of Justice to pursue moving cannabis to Schedule 3 as soon as possible, as well as directing Medicaid to begin covering certain types of cannabinoid products, specifically CBD products. This was kind of a big move, and I think one of the most progressive and forward, or at least most full-throated supports of moving cannabis to Schedule 3 that we've seen from any sitting president. That being said, it didn't actually make that process restart. So right now we're in a position where the rescheduling petition process is entirely in the hands of Attorney General Pam Bondi and, to a lesser extent, DEA Director Terry Cole. And we're still waiting on determining when exactly that process is going to restart and exactly what that looks like. It could take several different forms. The first being that we pick up exactly where we left off. Second being that there would just be a proposed rule immediately. And the third being that there could be a sort of a subset of a proposed rule, but something that is a little bit less binding and that will require additional hearings. Regardless, once that rule is made, there are 30 days in which opponents have to challenge it legally. And we know that our good buddies over at Project SAM fully intend to sue the government to stop this proposed rule. and they have the resources to be able to do it and to drag it on for many years. And there's actually precedent for this dragging on for many years. I think the last time that there was litigation involving a petition scheduling decision, the court cases dragged on for between 6 and 10 years, depending on what stage they were in. So we might be looking at quite a long wait until cannabis is moved to Schedule 3, if it is at all, because a lot of things can happen during that time period.
I hope everyone heard that we should be expecting litigation and that nothing about this process is fast. Up to this point, are there any questions for Morgan? There is, and Chris has a microphone right now. If you have a question, make sure you use the mic so that everyone can hear you. And then I'll repeat the question for our audience just in case. Raise your hand at any point if you do have questions while we're talking, and we'll try to get those answered for you.
Hello.
Hi.
Do a sound check.
Thank you.
My question is, what's Sam's relationship to all this, and who kind of backs them? Could you discuss that?
Well, so SPAM, or Smart Approaches to Marijuana, is an organization that was founded by Kevin Sabet, who is a former White House drug policy advisor and a longtime opponent of legalization. He's been at the forefront of every opposition effort that we've encountered, for the most part, in decades. And they supposedly claim that they want that they're okay with decriminalization, but the real agenda is to make sure that cannabis stays illegal, and that cannabis consumers, maybe rather than being criminalized, are subject to forced hospitalization, things like that. But they're incredibly well funded. I believe that in 2024 they reported something like $24 million in revenue. And they fund a whole lot of small little shadow pop-up groups all over the country, and are also funding the regulated market repeal efforts that are happening in 3 states right now, which we'll get into a little bit later. But these are folks that are ideologically opposed to cannabis and cannabis consumers across the board. And honestly, I think that some of them would recriminalize alcohol consumption if they could, but they recognize it's a political non-starter. But just to give you an idea of the type of folks that we're dealing with.
Thanks for that question. We rarely mention their names out loud on our shows because we don't want to give them any airtime, but for you, we broke that one rule. Morgan, let's talk about what Schedule 3 does and doesn't do. And I think this is where a lot of confusion comes in, both for your average American and even for people who are cannabis policy advocates. Even some experts are getting it wrong. We aren't. So let's talk about that.
Well, so I want to talk about what the major positive aspects of moving to Schedule 3 would be, and we can start with the intangibles. Symbolically, a move to Schedule 3 is incredibly important because it represents the first major change in federal cannabis policy, with how the federal government just looks at cannabis entirely. And it is a recognition by the federal government that cannabis does have medical value and does not have a high potential for abuse compared to other substances on various places on the schedule. This is really important because for a very long time, a lot of federal lawmakers have used that Schedule 1 designation as a crutch to avoid being able to, or having to talk about cannabis at all. As long as cannabis remains Schedule 1, there's no reason for them to talk about any sort of policy involving it because it is illegal. It's a bad drug. It's evil. We don't need to deal with it. A move to Schedule 3 means that they can no longer rely upon that argument and will have to actually engage in substantive policy discussions around cannabis and cannabis consumers, as well as regulation and how states, or how the federal government can interact with state programs. But it's also really important because a lot of state level lawmakers have consistently relied on this as well to avoid having to talk about making changes to state law. Despite the fact that we've seen more than 40 states enact successfully various forms of medical cannabis laws that we would consider to be effective medical cannabis programs, nearly every state has access to some form of cannabis legally, and 24 states and several territories have already made cannabis legal for adults. There are still a number of states where lawmakers say, as long as it's Schedule 1, we're not going to touch it. And so a move to Schedule 3 would soften some of those barriers and prevent lawmakers from having that fallback position that allows them to ignore serious cannabis policy discussions. Substantively, a move to Schedule 3 would allow state licensed cannabis businesses to finally be able to be taxed fairly, in that they would be able to deduct normal business expenses the way that any other industry can. Under current rules, cannabis businesses are taxed at an insane federal rate because they cannot deduct those expenses. And Schedule 3 would eliminate that problem. So let's talk about what Schedule 3 wouldn't do. Schedule 3 does not change the criminalization of cannabis at the federal level in any way, shape, or form. It does not end the conflict between state and federal law in either adult use or medical states. It does not make cannabis automatically FDA approved and subject to prescriptions by doctors. It does not really open up that many options for additional research. And I think that those are really, really important things to note, because there's a lot of confusion around exactly what this would do and what it won't do. And I think we really need to recognize what it won't do so that folks don't proceed on false assumptions that could lead to bad decisions down the road or potential legal consequences.
Right. So just to be clear, everyone in this room, and hopefully all of you watching, are clear. This is not if and when marijuana is moved to Schedule 3. This is about moving botanical cannabis. It's specific to the plant. The FDA does not regulate plants. The FDA is not going to start regulating plants. You are not going to get pre-rolls by prescription at CVS. This also does not, this is one that we hear all the time, and it's almost the point where it's hard to take it seriously when you hear it. But listen, this does not hand over the marijuana industry to Big Pharma. Please repeat after me. This does not hand over medical cannabis or regulated cannabis to Big Pharma, because the FDA does not regulate plants. So everything that's happening under Schedule 1 right now, all of these state-sanctioned cannabis regulatory structures, whether it be adult use or medical, they're all in conflict with federal law under Schedule 1. If marijuana were Schedule 3, we would all still be operating in conflict with federal law. Nothing changes.
That's absolutely correct. And I think that there's a lot of concern that all of a sudden every dispensary is going to have to get a DEA license and whatnot. That's just not going to happen. The real question is, if cannabis is moved to Schedule 3, what kind of enforcement we're going to be looking at. And I have to imagine that if the federal government is not strongly enforcing marijuana laws when it's a Schedule 1 substance, they're not going to be jumping over themselves to spend resources to make sure that people are complying with Schedule 3 status either. I mean, just the resource allocation doesn't make sense. And, I think that because there is no other substance like cannabis in Schedule 3, we're going to be in a very confusing and relatively opaque regulatory position that is probably going to require the FDA to do some pretty heavy revisions on exactly how they approach botanicals.
Yeah, absolutely. And at the state level here in Virginia, we're not looking at any significant impacts from that, other than what Morgan mentioned previously. And unfortunately, we have to add this caveat, I think, to literally everything we say about the federal government now. The way it should work is that a move to Schedule 3 should allow these operators, legal operators at the state level, to take standard business tax deductions. They cannot do that now. And that is why the cost of doing business in cannabis is so high. And that is why you see high prices in nascent markets like Virginia. So they should be able to, but of course, we don't really know what this version of federal government is going to do. So we would like to see rescheduling happen for Virginia. because we would like to see prices come down, and this is something that could make that happen here.
Yeah, and I mean, just in terms of timing, I think that we really have to look at the political context here. The administration has already gotten its political flowers from the rescheduling announcement, and are really under no sort of duress to make it happen in any sort of a quick timeline. And I think it's also important to note that this is not an issue that the president is particularly passionate about. This was done, I think, largely because of the desire to support a couple of Florida mega donors, including ones who stand to benefit significantly financially from allowing Medicaid reimbursements for CBD products, as well as a number of well-funded cannabis companies paying a lot of money to be able to be in a position to kiss the ring. But that's to a much lesser extent than some of these larger mega donors that were also pushing the issue. On the opposite side, you also have to look at some of the other kind of broader drug war context that is happening right now, where designation of people or organizations as narco terrorists provide a air cover basically to be able to engage in military operations and large scale financial law enforcement operations, where those sort of actions deliver big political wins. We also have to look at recent rescission of funding for a lot of harm reduction resources for serious problematic drug consumers. We have to look at the fact that there are a lot of hardcore prohibitionists who have been appointed to very important and weighty agency positions and cabinet positions within the federal government. We have to look at the fact that there are seriously two camps within the White House on polar opposite sides of this issue, where you have folks like Susie Wiles, who luckily is basically the boss, who's on our side and who has actually had some business dealings with larger cannabis operators in Florida through her consulting firm. And then folks on the other side, like Stephen Miller, Sean Duffy, the head of Department of Transportation, Pam Bondi, the Attorney General, Terry Cole, the head of the DEA, who are pretty staunch prohibitionists. And in fact, in the case of folks like Pam Bondi, have actively worked against legalization in their state level positions. So we really have to temper our expectations from this administration, and really from all presidential administrations, because this is still an issue that they kind of don't want to touch, and where there is a lot of conflict even within the halls of the White House and the various federal agencies that they control.
I think the conflict between these sort of two camps in the current federal administration is really interesting, and I think this in and of itself provides a really excellent example of how far your dollar can go when your dollar is very, very large at the federal level. And it's you mentioned boat bombings. It's interesting that we're seeing boats being bombed in the middle of the ocean, and then we're seeing the same person turn around and talk about rescheduling marijuana. It's just wild. Do we have any questions? Mark, do we see a question over here? Let's sort of look at wrapping up the rescheduling conversation, and then Morgan's going to talk about some other action in Congress, if that helps you plan out what you want to ask.
Hi, you mentioned in the beginning that Pam Bondi and Terry Cole would go through the process. There's 3 outcomes, proposed rule, a subset, or kind of status quo. Can you talk more about how they'll make that decision and what that investigation into making that decision looks like?
It's kind of a black box, to tell you the truth. There's really no way to determine what the internal conversations are. We know for a fact that there is institutional opposition to moving cannabis off of Schedule 1 from within the DEA and from within what's left of the larger DOJ. I think one of the things that people should be a little bit scared about, and I know this isn't directly responding to your question, but I think it's really kind of important and ancillarily or tertiarily related to that, is that a lot of the position of the DEA and the larger Department of Justice for the last decade has been predicated upon non-interference, especially since 2018, when then Attorney General Jeff Sessions rescinded the Cole memo. In the time period since then, we did not see a huge crackdown from federal prosecutors on state legal adult use cannabis businesses. They were still prevented from doing that for medical businesses or patients because of the Rohrabacher-Farr protections, which we'll get into it a little bit later. But largely, this non-interference was based upon the preferences and experiences of federal prosecutors in those areas and jurisdictions that recognized that it was a poor use of their resources to go after people that were in compliance with state law when it came to adult use cannabis, and so chose not to do that. Almost all of those people have been fired or quit in the last year. And so we are now in a position where we have federal prosecutors who are really riding on a sort of a tough on crime mandate. And so it's a little bit difficult to tell exactly where their priorities are going to be. And they still have the legal ability to start cracking down on state legal programs. And that just gives you an idea of, the things that we should be considering in addition to what the strategy, or at least what the direction and timeline of DOJ management is going to be when it comes to the actual legal aspects of moving cannabis out of Schedule 1 and into Schedule 3. And it's also possible that the proposed rule could be to move to Schedule 3, but with a bunch of additional regulations, particularly regarding things like, treaty compliance and, public safety. So we don't exactly know what it's going to look like, but I think that what we can expect is for the process to take a long time and be fairly dragged out, because we know that the White House isn't going to expend a bunch of capital on making it move faster, absent some occurrence in politics that requires an additional bump. And we also know that institutionally, the Department of Justice and to a much greater extent the DEA are opposed to this change. And so we should expect that when it does happen, that there's going to be a slow rollout, and that it's going to be probably a lot more tightly regulated and confusing than we would like it to be, or than just a clean move to Schedule 3.
I understand your answer was satisfactory. So any other questions about rescheduling? Fantastic. I don't see any online either. They can ask questions online. We can see them. So Morgan, let's move on to what's happening in Congress. Is there any standalone legislation related to cannabis policy that you're keeping your eye on?
The 119th Congress was a little bit slower than some of the previous Congresses that we've seen. I think that this is not just related to cannabis as well. We're seeing things move pretty slowly in Congress in terms of standalone legislation. The vast majority of the focus has been on keeping the government funded and arguments about exactly how to do that. I think that there was a lot of misconception that the big beautiful bill HR 1 ended the Rohrabacher-Farr protections. And just for a little bit of background, since 2014, cannabis has been included in what's called the Commerce, Justice, Science, and Related Agencies Appropriations Bill, in that there was a rider that prevented the Department of Justice from interfering with state medical cannabis programs. That's been in place for 10 years. And that's been pretty much the biggest political win that we've had in Congress overall since the movement started. That's become so commonplace and so uncontroversial that it's baked into the base language of these bills pretty much every single year. There was a lot of misconception that those protections were lost when the big beautiful bill was passed. That was not the case. They continued up until and through the government shutdown, and were continued until January 30th when the government shutdown ender deal was passed, and were just renewed by Congress. Most of the action that we're seeing is in appropriations, but there is increasing opportunity to move standalone legislation. But I really want to stress that it's unlikely that we're going to see anything get really full committee hearings, full floor votes in the current Congress, especially when we're rolling into the midterms right now. But that being said, there are some bills out there right now, and we're working to gain as many co-sponsors on them as possible, including the MORE Act, which is the only legalization bill that's ever passed a chamber of Congress. It passed the House twice, but has never been brought up for a vote in the Senate. This bill would deschedule cannabis and provide some regulatory structure, as well as containing a significant amount of restorative justice language, which would help address some of the harms caused by cannabis prohibition. And then we have some that are slightly less comprehensive, such as the States 2.0 Act, which basically creates an exemption for the CSA for any states that choose to legalize cannabis for medical or adult use purposes. So this wouldn't be clean descheduling bill, but it would basically make any state that legalizes cannabis exempt from considering themselves subject to the Controlled Substances Act's positioning of cannabis as a Schedule I substance. There are also a number of more incremental bills that I think are really important, and I think potentially could move quite quickly in the next Congress if we're able to build enough momentum for them right now. These are bills to address things like discrimination in public housing for lawful cannabis consumers. At some point in the near future, legislation that will address Second Amendment rights for cannabis consumers, and there's already some Supreme Court cases that are being considered to deal with that, as well as ATF proposed rules to somewhat lessen those restrictions. We're talking about bills that would allow VA doctors to be able to recommend cannabis to patients within their system, thereby not forcing veterans to go outside of the VA system if they wanted to get medical cannabis recommendations in their states. There's also legislation that would allow the drug czar, the head of the Office of National Drug Control Policy, who, by the way, was actually just confirmed, a person named Sarah Carter, who actually has been supportive of medical cannabis in the past, at least according to public statements, but who is prevented by law from talking about any sort of policy changes regarding Schedule I substances or even researching them. So there is a bill that has been offered by the leaders of the Cannabis Caucus that would finally allow the head of ONDCP and the agency at large to be able to talk about legalization and potentially promote it if the studies show that it's a good idea, which clearly we know that they have. But yeah, at this point, I expect that we're going to see some additional legislation coming across the bench fairly shortly. I know that there's probably a lot of folks in the audience that are wondering about what's happening with safe banking. All indications are that it's a relatively low priority at this point. There are a lot more folks on the GOP side interested in pushing it than on the Democratic side, because it really does not contain any sort of social justice provisions, and Republicans aren't particularly interested in making it move in any sort of a fast fashion. So I think that we will eventually see it be reintroduced in the current Congress, but like with all of the other incremental and comprehensive bills, I don't foresee them really moving that much at all in terms of being able to approach votes. So our jobs collectively are to make sure that we can get as many co-sponsors on these bills as possible and try to build up momentum for them rolling into the 120th Congress, so that hopefully we can get quick reintroduction as soon as that Congress begins on all of these bills and start demanding time in committee to be able to start getting some traction on them.
Morgan, let's talk about DC.
Oh yeah, well, DC keeps getting screwed.
What's going on there? Let's talk about our tiny neighbor to the north.
Yeah, so once again, Congress is moving language that is preventing DC from being able to spend any resources on regulating cannabis for adults. For many, many, many years, the district was prevented from regulating medical cannabis. There was a lawmaker named Bob Barr who was a staunch cannabis opponent, and then after retiring from Congress, became a staunch medical cannabis proponent, and actually helped defeat his own rider that was preventing the district from being able to regulate medical cannabis. At that point, we saw the the growth of a nascent medical cannabis system within the district, and then back in 2014, voters approved an adult use legalization measure that was designed to be able to basically get around the fact that Congress was still preventing the district from being able to use any resources to actually regulate cannabis. So as it stands right now, cannabis is legal for adults in the district, but there's no adult use market, just medical market.
Just like here.
It's created a very, very confusing system, and those prohibitions, or at least the spending prohibitions, have been included again in the funding bill that controls DC's budget. Yeah, so I mean, just speaking generally about appropriations, where we've had most of our victories, there's been sort of a staggered process right now affecting both DC as well as every other state that has either an adult use or medical program. DC is a lot easier for the federal government to mess with because of the federal oversight of all of its spending. And we see a lot of members of Congress, particularly folks like Andy Harris from Maryland, who sit on key committees that control DC's funding and who are rabid prohibitionists, continue using my town as a bully pulpit to throw their weight around in ways that are significantly anti-cannabis and in ways that their own voters and their own states would not tolerate.
Morgan, do you think there's any impact to the district by rescheduling? Do you think that opens the door at all for the district to move forward with regulating the retail sale of cannabis to adults 21 and older?
It would make it a lot easier for the businesses that exist in the district to be able to afford their tax bill, but that's about it.
Yeah. Okay. What do we talked about Rohrabacher Farr a little bit, didn't we, earlier?
We did, but I do want to just kind of stress that those protections are still in place. So the Department of Justice cannot spend any resources going after any patients or providers in medical cannabis states that are in compliance with state law. We have been trying for years to get that expanded to adult use programs, despite the fact that in practice we're not seeing a lot of egregious enforcement. But it still would make everybody sleep a lot better at night to have that enshrined in law. And appropriations is pretty much where we have been able to get traction when we can't pass standalone legislation. One of the things that was actually a little bit terrifying over this past year was that in the last two negotiation sessions for funding the federal government, there were attempts to include language in the CJS bill that I referenced earlier that created a carve-out exemption for those medical cannabis protections, such that any patient within 1,000 feet of a school, university, playground, or public housing unit who was growing a single plant, who was in possession of more than 5 grams of cannabis, who was in possession of cannabis in multiple containers, would have been subject to federal prosecution with double penalties and mandatory minimums. As well as any business that was operating within that buffer zone, anybody that may have been making a delivery within that buffer zone, even a B2B transfer that happened to go through one of those buffer zones. Luckily, we were able to get that stripped out of the most recent federal minibus that was just approved last week and is now sitting on the president's desk awaiting signature, which we expect. Also absent from that bill was language that had been proposed earlier that would have prevented any federal agency from spending money to reschedule cannabis. Basically, it would have hamstrung the Department of Justice from following the executive order that President Trump issued and reserve the right to reschedule cannabis solely to Congress. That language was absent again, but I do expect it to be reintroduced in some form in later spending bills, so we're going to have to be vigilant. I expect there to be another attempt at that buffer zone language as well that would weaken the medical cannabis protections that states have been depending on for a decade now.
And this is just one of the many things that we're talking about when we at NORML are explaining that this is the work we're doing to protect your rights. Right? It's easy when you are in a state where you have cannabis freedom to forget what it was like before. And Morgan is representing you on Capitol Hill. Morgan is the guy who is there making sure that cannabis consumers do not lose their freedom, right? So
it can all go away
thanks,
real quick.
Morgan.
I appreciate it. But yeah, it can all go away really quickly. And really all it takes is, the cuffs being taken off A.G. Bondi, some overzealous federal prosecutors in a given state, high intensity drug trafficking area leaders deciding that they want to double down on enforcement, agencies outside of DOJ deciding to take up enforcement when DOJ can't. We have actually already seen in New Mexico, and it's starting to spread elsewhere, where especially along border states, because Customs and Border Patrol have jurisdiction within 100 miles of the United States border. And something that we've seen for the last 2 years, specifically in New Mexico, is that producers in the southern portion of the state shipping product to retailers in the northern portion of the state, not even across state lines, and in entire compliance with state law, and not engaging in any sort of interstate commerce whatsoever, are getting stopped at CBP checkpoints and having their entire shipments seized, having their vehicles seized, and having their drivers be arrested and held for days in some cases, with zero explanation, zero oversight. And so we've been trying to keep an eye on that to make sure that DHS is not able to do that. But at the current political environment, any sort of restrictions on DHS's behavior are pretty much a non-starter. Luckily, we did get one piece of language inserted into a recent spending bill that is still moving through the process of being approved that requires the Department of Homeland Security to offer a report to Congress within 6 months, talking about exactly what their enforcement has been with legal intrastate cannabis shipments. And hopefully we'll be able to get a little bit more of a spotlight on that, because right now, CBP in those states are doing basically whatever the hell they want and are not subject to the roadblock or FAR medical cannabis protections that have been in place for the last decade for the Department of Justice.
And we've only seen this in New Mexico so far. We do actually have an operator from New Mexico here today. But it's concerning that it's happening in that state, and it doesn't mean it couldn't happen in another state. And this started before the other issues around Border Patrol that we're already seeing in every state.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that's one of the things that we do have to consider, whether we're looking at, particularly when we're looking at the federal government and it's the executive side in terms of agencies and things like that. I think one of the worst calls that I think I made over the last year was the expectation that last Congress, the only cannabis legislation that really moved at all, that got a committee vote and actually an overwhelmingly supportive bipartisan committee vote, was what was called the CURE Act, which would have prevented discrimination for past cannabis use in federal employment suitability and security clearances. Originally, it was supposed to be current use, but negotiations with the GOP and in particular James Comer on the House Oversight Committee led to that being watered down, but it still passed overwhelmingly, 30-14 in a Republican-led committee. So that was really the only bill that moved at all last year or last session. So I was thinking, all right, we have an opportunity here, especially when we were expecting that there was going to be a significant effort to shrink the size of the federal government. What I did not anticipate was that federal authorities wanted to keep that there so that they had excuses to fire people. I think that that is one of the things that we are going to have to continue to watch out for going forward, both in terms of employment, but also just overall that cannabis prohibition is a very, very useful tool for the authorities to be able to throw their weight around, whether that be shrinking federal agencies and laying people off for supposed cause, whether that be finding easy excuses to deport people. And I should say that cannabis possession is consistently in the top 5 reasons for deportation triggers year after year after year after year. It's a good excuse to be able to wield some power against people. And we saw that the administration wants to continue to hold on to that ability for as long as possible. Perfect example of that is the recent rescission of previously unknown Biden-era guidance for federal prosecutors not to bother people about possession on, or like low-level possession on federal land. Nobody even knew about that guidance, and then federal prosecutors at the direction of the Department of Justice rescinded that guidance to assert their ability to continue arresting people for minor possession on federal land. So we have to watch out for these things at the federal level, because cannabis has always been a useful tool to be able to criminalize people, and has been since the beginning of Prohibition.
Morgan, it's almost like elections have consequences.
Indeed.
Chris, fix that. Sorry. Hey, everyone who's watching this on a live stream is getting a better view than they're getting in the audience right now, because our screen just shut off. Morgan, elections obviously have consequences, and we have some midterms coming up. I want to talk briefly about those and then do a quick overview of some of the crazy things that are happening at the state level and in other states, fortunately. And then we're going to wrap up at 11:30. Morgan, let's talk about the midterm elections.
Yeah, I mean, I think that these midterms are largely going to decide whether or not we're able to move standalone legislation in the 120th Congress. Even though this issue still is not a priority for Democrats, we have seen that when Democrats are in charge of Congress, they are more likely to move this legislation, although they still take a significant amount of prodding. When Republicans are in charge, it is very nearly impossible for us to be able to get committee hearings and move forward to floor votes. And I think that specifically this is a problem because on the House side, we have a lot of really staunch prohibitionists in charge of some of the primary committees that we need to go through. Jim Jordan is a perfect example from my home state of Ohio, in charge of the Judiciary Committee. So whoever has control of Congress, I think it's going to be a big indicator of how much progress we're going to be able to make in the 120th congressional session. Also, I think that, unfortunately, we see from polling that support among Republican voters has been slipping when it comes to support for cannabis legalization. And I don't think that that's necessarily directly related to cannabis, although there have been some pretty successful results to overblow and exaggerate the harms caused by cannabis, particularly when it comes to things like traffic and emergency room visits, where a lot of that data is being obfuscated and is not really a causal relationship. But some of that is taking hold. But there's also sort of a hyperpartisan knee-jerk reaction where this issue has traditionally been viewed as being owned by Democrats. And so a lot of Republican candidates will just instinctively push back on that whenever the issue comes up, because they think that it's a Democratic issue. For several years leading up to the situation where we're in now, that was not really the case, and was starting to move more in a better direction, where this was a completely bipartisan issue. But just the hyperpartisanship that's happening on all issues is leading to cannabis policy kind of being an unwitting victim of that. So I expect to see a lot more really negative vitriol coming from GOP candidates in the lead up. And so I think that it's incumbent upon all of us to make sure that candidates know that that's not a good position, and that they will get more support by trying to beat each other to the best position on cannabis than they will by trying to take the polar opposite position of wherever they think their opponent is.
And I know you might be asking, how can I do that? How can I let my lawmakers know that I care about this issue? Good news, we have that resource for you. If you visit the NORML Take Action Center, this is at norml.org/act. We have multiple action alerts. So you can click and send an email directly to your lawmakers, both at the state and federal level, depending on the action alert. It takes 30 seconds. The letter's pre-written. You can edit it if you want. You can send it multiple times. Pro tip for that, just change the subject line. But we make it really easy for you to let your lawmakers know that this is an issue you support. And here's the time where I do the disclaimer and say, listen, NORML is a nonpartisan organization, but we have to say words like Democrat and Republican to tell you who is doing what. And when one side does things that we don't like, that's we got to say the words out loud. It doesn't make us partisan, it just makes us factual. Okay.
Yeah. And I had to say, I think everybody in Congress has been pretty disappointing on this issue, with a few exceptions of some of our champions in the Cannabis Caucus.
The last time we had a really fantastic, in my opinion, Republican champion in Congress was when Tom Garrett was there. He's here now. He's back at the state level, but he carried the Ending Federal Marijuana Prohibition Act of 2017. He gave an award for it.
And the current Republican co-chairs of the Cannabis Caucus, Brian Mast and David Joyce, are really phenomenal on this issue. Unfortunately, they're the only registered members on the GOP side of the caucus. And so that, I think, is something else that both like NORML has been working on for a while, and that I encourage all of you to do. We actually do have an action on our Take Action page, specifically urging members of Congress to join the Cannabis Caucus in an official capacity. Because the more people are willing to stand up and be recognized for their support for sensible cannabis policy reform, whatever that might look like to them, the more voices that we have at the table, the more chance we have to be able to move legislation. So I encourage everybody to contact their lawmakers, and even if there's not specific legislation that you want to urge them to support, urge them to join the Cannabis Caucus so that they can be part of the conversation. And also, in addition to that tool, anytime any of y'all are heading up to DC, if you want to go talk to members of Congress, shoot me an email with a little bit of advance notice, and I can help set up meetings with their staff.
Thank you for that generous offer to our audience, Morgan, and everyone watching online. Morgan, we've got a few minutes left, and I want to talk about the attacks on cannabis freedom that are happening around the country, and the deep, deep pockets that are sinking millions of dollars into repealing legalization. It's not happening in our state, but it is happening in a number of others. Let's get into those. Let's just go alphabetically and start with Arizona.
Well, before we get into the ballot initiative states that we're dealing with right now, I think that it's important to recognize that last year we saw more legislative attempts to reverse legalization and strip rights and recriminalize various cannabis-related behaviors than we've ever seen before. Places like Montana, where they were proposing if you wanted to be able to purchase cannabis legally as an adult, you had to be on a registry and have a specific card, which obviously would eliminate your ability to own a firearm. Very popular in Montana. That bill went down in flames. I expect that to come up again in some form. We saw attempts to restrict the ability of voters to be able to change cannabis policy. In Idaho, the legislature passed a measure that will go before the voters this year that would make the ability to change cannabis policy solely rest with the legislature and steal that from voters. In Ohio, we saw a lot of innocuous, harmless cannabis-related behavior become recriminalized, as well as a lot of hemp products be criminalized. General restrictions across the board. Some of them, most of them have not been very successful. But in South Dakota, we saw that we missed having their medical program be repealed by one vote. One vote would have been the difference between the first state ever repealing medical cannabis access. This is not something that we can allow to happen. As of right now, no state has ever walked back any significant portion of their cannabis legalization laws. And we need to keep it that way, because once those our opponents have their foot in the door that way, I think that we're going to see just an increase in both their funding, but also in lawmakers thinking like, oh, okay, this is possible. So we saw a lot of legislation last year. We're going to continue to see probably a lot of opposition or repeal language in legislation this year. But we're also facing currently 3 ballot initiatives that are at various stages of the ballot initiative qualification process that would keep possession legal for adults, but would completely repeal the adult use market. Now, I think some consumers are thinking like, oh, well, that doesn't directly impact me. It absolutely does, because you will no longer have a legal place to buy cannabis. And I believe in the case of Massachusetts, this would actually remove the ability for adults to be able to cultivate cannabis at home. In Arizona, it leaves home cultivation. I believe in Maine, it leaves home cultivation as well. But nobody should be fooled about what the true intent of these are. This is the canary in the coal mine to find out exactly how far they can get. And then once you eliminate the legal access in the market and the benefits that are provided by that market, by consumers being able to safely access quality controlled products, and the tax revenue that it's generated, and the shrinking of the unregulated market, and in many cases, some of the criminal activity that's associated with that. Once those benefits are gone, it becomes a lot easier for our opponents to start chipping away at the ability to legally possess and use cannabis. So nobody should have any illusions about what the true goal of these measures are. And, unfortunately, our opponents are pretty unscrupulous and unethical. They know that they've lost hearts and minds, and the only way that they're going to get on the ballot is by tricking people. And in all three of these states, in Arizona, Maine, and Massachusetts, we've already seen reports that ballot initiative signature gatherers are misleading voters in order to get the signatures necessary to qualify for the ballot. And these states have pretty lax laws that prevent a lot of those signatures from being disqualified, even when you can clearly show proof of malfeasance in the signature gathering process. I fully expect these campaigns to be really obtuse and disingenuous when it comes to talking to voters about what these initiatives would actually do once they do get on the ballot. And so it is going to be vitally important for all of us, even if you don't live in those states, to do everything we can to make sure that folks know exactly what these initiatives would do, to make sure to expose any of the misinformation and the malfeasance that these folks are committing on a daily basis, and to make sure that these things go down in flames.
And we have all of these resources available for you, because of course we do, on our website. NORML's Election Central, it's normal.org/election. We break down what each proposed ballot initiative does, as well as the proposed constitutional amendments. Those are there as well. Idaho, for example, the legislature decided that they know better and that they're the only ones who should be allowed to make decisions about cannabis legalization or regulation. And so they are telling voters, hey, you go to the ballot box and vote. Do you want to give up your right to vote on this ever? I can't imagine as a voter why I would go and cast a vote to take away my ability to vote. But that's on the ballot for a constitutional amendment in Idaho.
It may be on the same ballot as a medical cannabis initiative as well. We're seeing a growing movement there to get something on the ballot that would finally allow patients in Idaho to not have to go to Oregon and to be free from arrest in their own home state. But that'll be very interesting, where voters will have the opportunity to potentially pass a medical cannabis bill while also pass a bill that says that they can't pass any other medical cannabis or adult use legislation ever.
Wild. And you mentioned Ohio a little bit ago. Ohio voters voted to legalize marijuana, and the Ohio legislature said, but we don't like how you did it, so we're going to change the law, okay? This is happening state after state after state. We are not being hyperbolic when we say that cannabis freedom is under attack across the nation. And yes, there are many industry associations out there that can support corporate interests. There is one organization out there that is solely focused on protecting consumers, and that's NORML. That's all we've done since 1970, and that's all we intend to do for as long as we exist. That is fight for the rights of responsible cannabis consumers and make sure that you have the freedoms you deserve. Morgan, is there anything else you want to wrap up with our audience here and there, and before we let you go?
We could keep talking all day, but I know that there's a lot of other stuff to cover that's outside of my own wheelhouse. But I really appreciate having me. Again, I wish I could be there in person. Super bummed, but everybody stay safe out there.
I'm glad we were able to make this work. Does anyone have any questions for Morgan before we have a question for you, Morgan, before you depart?
Hello. So one question is, last year, as we know, the Continuing Appropriations and Extensions Act of 2026 redefined hemp to a very narrow level of to what it is, before that, which goes into effect in November. Is there any interest for NORML to kind of push that or extend that November date to a further date?
Well, there are actually two bills in place right now on the House side. One of which would completely repeal that language from the appropriations bill. The other would basically create a significant delay until that is implemented in order for the federal government to kind of figure out exactly what they want to do. I tend to think that the delay option is getting a little bit more juice right now, I think that it's tough to tell whether it will get floor space, but there is significant interest in it. I think one of the outcomes that I would like to see from this is more of everybody coming back together to get back into the same tent and deal with cannabis as a single plant and a single substance, and everybody focus on descheduling rather than all of us like fighting in a crab bucket for little handouts and carve-outs for specific types of products. But we're definitely going to be tracking that legislation, and anything that we can do to help promote cannabis freedoms and consumer access to safe and regulated cannabinoids, we're definitely going to do. But at this point, I think that it's tough to tell exactly what's going to happen. It's pretty clear that there is significant opposition in Congress to this, and it's still a little bit confusing why that language was really even included, other than the stumping by a few very powerful members. So yeah, we're definitely going to be working on that. And of course, the appropriations battle begins again on January 31st. Provided that we don't have a government shutdown. So it is entirely possible that outside of the standalone legislation to directly repeal or delay those provisions that were passed in November, that the next appropriations bill will draw back that language.
Thank you.
Oh, I see one more question.
Hi, what bills should we be watching? Do you have the HB bill numbers?
You can go to NORML.org/act. I'm actually in the process of updating it for a bunch of other bills that haven't included yet. But the thing that we want to get the most support on and the most co-sponsors on right now, at least on the House side, is the MORE Act. We want to get above 110 co-sponsors before the elections, if possible, so that we're in a stronger position to move forward in the 120th Congress. As I said, that's passed twice before, but has never been in the Senate, or at least never come to a vote in the Senate. We also expect on the Senate side, not introduction of the MORE Act, but reintroduction of the Cannabis Administration and Opportunity Act, hopefully with some tweaks that we've been suggesting over the years to the big three. So Senators Schumer, Wyden, and Booker. But we don't have a solid timeline on when that's going to be reintroduced on the Senate side. But when it is, we'll be sure to let folks know so that we can try to work together to get as many co-sponsors on that as possible before the end of the session as well. My personal baby bill is the Marijuana and Federally Assisted Housing Parity Act, introduced in the House by DC's Delegate Eleanor Holmes Norton, and on the Senate side by Cory Booker, that would prevent discrimination for lawful cannabis use in public housing units, as well as prevent people from getting evicted for lawfully using cannabis, and would create a requirement for HUD to develop guidelines for how people can use cannabis safely in public housing units without bothering their neighbors. That bill has never really progressed that far, but it's one that I think is relatively low-hanging fruit, and especially when being unhoused is being increasingly criminalized around the country, is absolutely vitally important at this point in time.
And this bill that Morgan's talking about is at the top of NORML's Take Action Center. You're going to find that at norml.org/act. You'll also find the MORE Act there. The MORE Act happens to be HR 5068. There's also the Veterans Equal Access Act, which is HR 1384. There's a bill we'd like you to oppose. That's the No Deductions for Marijuana Businesses Act. That's HR 1447 and S 471. All of these are right there at the top of norml.org/act, where you can click and send a message to your federal lawmakers. Really, it's going to take you about 30 seconds. The most challenging part about sending an action alert to your federal lawmakers is that you have to choose a subject. It doesn't matter what you pick. It doesn't matter what you pick. It doesn't matter what you pick. All that does is say, it goes to this intern. And I don't care which intern it goes to, as long as it goes to someone. So pick whatever topic you want. We have no control over what that is. We also have no control over what title you have to pick from. That is all mandated by either the House's API or the Senate's API, or if it's targeting like the president or something by that API. So pick whatever you have to pick to make it go through. Just make sure you are sending those emails to your federal lawmakers. And then, of course, go down to your state and see what's pending in your state and send those action alerts as well. And, of course, for all of those of you who are looking at Virginia, because this is the Virginia Cannabis Conference, we have one action alert up right now for a state bill in Virginia, and we will have more as session progresses. All right, if we're done with Morgan, let's all say thank you. Thanks, Morgan. All right, thanks, Morgan. I'll see you on staff on Tuesday.
Keep up the fight, everybody.
All right, everyone. Thank you to all of you who have joined us online, and to all of you in the audience who are awkwardly looking at me on the screen instead of right in front of your face. This concludes our first panel. We will be back at 1 o'clock with our next panel. So if you are watching this streaming either on NORML's YouTube or on Virginia NORML's Facebook, keep it open, and we'll be back later. Thanks so much for joining us.